All right, let's talk about how to create musical ideas. When I was a young composer, I had no idea how to create musical ideas. I would just sit down at Sibelius and start putting notes in with my mouse and then play that back and go, do I like that? And when I found something that I liked, I would work with that as my musical idea for my piece. Now being a lot older, I've been composing for over 13 years now, and I have a much more sophisticated process for creating musical ideas. So today I want to talk about the two processes that I go through when I'm at the starting process of a compositional project in order to generate musical ideas so that then I can work from those ideas to create a full piece. So just a bit of information on myself. I'm currently a master's student completing my thesis. My thesis is going to be a 4-movement orchestral work, and it will likely be my first symphony. I've always wanted to compose a symphony, so this is really the completion of a lifelong dream of mine. I got into composing and orchestral music, specifically listening to symphonies by composers like Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Mahler. And so it's really fun to attempt to create another work that will be part of that tradition, which has gone on for many hundreds of years. My compositional process looks something like this. It starts out with a long period of time where I tend to try and create ideas unsuccessfully, and I get really self-critical and I get really down on my abilities to create anything of value. And this process usually lasts for about 80% of the total duration of time that I have available to compose the piece. Then after this sort of phase is over, it usually ends with a distinct moment where I find an idea that I really like. And then from there, I usually compose that idea out and figure out how it's going to fall. The idea is going to create a form. I put it into the form and I compose out my musical ideas. And then there's a final step, which is like putting final touches on, adding really in-depth dynamics, maybe changing a bit of the instrumentation around, that kind of thing, engraving, and then getting it to performers. So that's sort of how my process looks. The middle stage obviously is a little bit more involved and complicated. I go through some more processes there, like one of them is I'll write a bunch of stuff out by hand and then I'll make the transition over to the computer at some point. But that's really like, it's an active part of my workflow. I don't necessarily start exclusively, do the entire piece by paper, then the entire piece on the computer. It's really much more integrated than that. I've always had this desire as a composer to not spend 80% of my time being self-critical and working on ideas. I would like to spend a lot more time shaping those ideas. So for me, making this video is also trying to help me explore my process of creating ideas and see if I can do it a little bit more efficiently and effectively. So David Bruce, another composer on YouTube, also produced a video about ways to vary ideas, and I think that that video is really useful for once you already have a musical idea. So check that out after you've composed a musical idea, but now let's get into ways to actually create that initial seed, that initial idea that will bloom into your entire piece. So the first way to create a musical idea is to just let it happen or improvise. Now, this one can be really tricky, but I like to do it at an instrument that I'm not particularly skilled on, like the piano, so that my technique and my technical knowledge of the instrument doesn't actually influence my creation of the musical idea. If I'm playing it on the harp, for instance, I know how harp technique works and what chords feel nice on the hand and what chords don't feel nice. And so what I end up doing is I'll just default to something that fits well in the hand and is comfortable. So I like to generate musical ideas on an instrument that isn't my primary instrument. So if you play piano, maybe you can find a guitar or something like that to generate some musical ideas. So something I might do in this case is just put my hands down on the keyboard and play a chord. So then after you play the chord, you get to ask yourself the question, what is this chord like? How does it make me feel? Is it useful for anything? For me, this chord feels like kind of a blend between E minor and E major. It has the F sharp and G sharp from E major, and then it has the G natural from E minor. So it gets that kind of weird like 7th chord vibe, but from both keys. Personally, my own disposition is to avoid chords that are quite dissonant and move towards chords that feel somehow consonantly rooted. So I might challenge myself in the early creative process. And what I'll do is I'll just take a small piece of paper and I'll write the chord down and then I'll set it aside. I can always come back to it later and play it again and say, is that useful for something? Do I like it? But at least I've recorded it so that I can remember that idea. For me, this chord feels kind of like mixed between almost like a heaviness, but it also has this brightness within it. I think it's the mix of major and minor. So it feels conflicted in some way. So perhaps if I was composing something that had a very conflicted nature, and that's what I wanted to get across, this chord might be useful for me. So write down your ideas. And if you have a feeling about it or something like that, you can always write a little piece of text to accompany the musical idea so that it'll help you remembering when you pull it out. Oh yeah, I remember what that musical idea was. So something else I could do with that chord is I could figure out how it would work as a melody. So if I have this chord, I could try and figure out ways now that I can use this chord melodically. So it could be something like, I'm just going to start on one of the notes of the chord and then move through other notes of the chord to get to a final note in the chord. So something like that, I actually really like that. I like that more than the chord itself. So then it would be great to record this little musical idea as a melodic idea. Now it could have chord tones around it, so I could use part of them as an accompaniment. Cool. So I've turned that idea now into something that is a little bit more musical. It's got a rhythm, it has a melody, and it also has some kind of accompaniment, which was that seventh. So this is one way of generating musical materials. You can just start by improvising, letting your hands fall onto keys or just randomly playing something and seeing if you like it. Record that and then think about ways that you can vary it or make it into a different musical expression. If it's a melody, how can it be a chord? If it's a chord, how can it be a melody? The second way of creating musical ideas is with some kind of extra musical inspiration. So recently, I've been observing some robins building a nest, actually on the side of my house. And then they built the nest, laid eggs, and then the eggs hatched, and then the babies actually flew out of the nest yesterday and the day before. So it's been really interesting watching that whole process come to life outside. And a big part of my thesis project is going to be about incorporating elements of nature and sustainability into music. So for me, this was the perfect opportunity to look at it and go, is there a way to express musically what the robins did? So that's where the video is going to go from now. I'm going to film myself working on the piece and working on some musical ideas, specifically around this idea of birds nesting and then hatching and then flying out of the nest. I think it's a really interesting way to observe life. And so I'm going to try and set it musically in some way that also has the qualities that the bird had at each of its stages. So while I'm recording, I'll make little notes and show off some video clips of the different musical ideas that I came up, specifically around this idea of birds making a nest, hatching, and flying out of the nest. Okay, so let's examine this idea of robins building a nest. So the first step is they scout the location, they find where they want to make the nest. Then they accumulate a bunch of twigs and bramble and bushes and that kind of thing to that location. Then the mother sits on the nest and hatches or lays a bunch of eggs. And then really the mother camps there for a while, like doesn't move at all. It was crazy seeing her there for like basically 2 weeks just sitting on the nest doing nothing else. And then after that process, the chicks hatch and both the mother and the father go off and they hunt for worms and food and then they bring it back and feed it to the babies. And then after that, the babies finally are large enough and then they kind of like awkwardly fly out of the nest. They're really derpy and funny. They just like, I got like within inches of one because they don't really know what to do. They don't know to be scared. And then they fly away and they like can't hold on to branches and stuff. So they're kind of awkward and silly when they first are hatched. Anyways, this whole process is fascinating, but what's a good musical setting of this? So let's try and figure that out. Okay, so the first process that the birds have is they try and find a proper location. So I kind of feel like for this part of the process, I want to find a way to sort of simulate birds flying because they're moving around and looking, and then every once in a while they come to rest in a certain location, and then maybe they fly off to a different location and then they come back to rest. So for me, it's like birds have this kind of like fluttering kind of motion, so it's quickly all at once whenever they take off and whenever they land. So maybe it has to do something with that kind of like maybe it's a scale or something like a see, like they could be doing that to fly, and then they land on a location, and the location is like a harmony, that kind of thing, and then you fly somewhere else and land on a different harmony. I don't really like this idea, so I'm probably going to just move on without writing it down. Again, have small pieces of paper available that you can record ideas on, then at least the idea won't slip away. You will have seen in my other shot that I had tons and tons of pieces of paper just kind of like littered all around the piano right now while I'm figuring out these musical ideas. So another musical idea might be to have an arpeggio, so a collection of pitches, and that's kind of like the flying gesture for the birds. So So with that one, I wanted to have these kind of arpeggios that were going up and down. And then when I found sort of a location, like the birds were finding it, it would be this oscillation between two notes in a harmony. And then more fluttering motion. And that time when I had the fluttering motion the second time, I played an additional note, which was just sustained. And that sustained note for me was like, that's a little bit more sure footing, but not quite good enough. And then the final one, I played the full like power chord underneath it to give a strong sense that the robins had like found a place that was secure and home. And then from there, I had this sort of like, I continued with the arpeggio motion as a way of symbolizing that the birds were flying and moving about. And then whenever they came back to the harmony, I was going to build the harmony. So adding a note of the harmony until we had something like that, like a quite built up, dense harmony, which would represent the nest. And then that harmonic material can be used as sort of a bed under which I could put other ideas on top, like the idea of an egg. So how would we musically represent an egg? So moving on to the next idea, which is the idea of an egg. So what is an egg? An egg is obviously the beginning stages of some form of life. So in that sense, it holds within it the potential for a life. Very much like a motive at the beginning of a piece. And in it, there's a whole piece, but that's just the seed of the idea, or the egg, the beginning stages. An egg has that kind of inherent potential in it, so it's something quite simple. You can use it to create something very full. So maybe in that case, the egg or an egg in the nest, because there were 4 baby robins in the nest that was by my house, maybe each one of them is a different interval. And those different intervals get played out into different kind of musical expressions when they hatch and when they fly. So there could be, with this harmonic bed, which is this kind of like summation of an F Lydian scale. I'm calling it Lydian because the diminished fifth is on the outside. We have this summation, and maybe there are a couple intervals in here that I want to pull out and say those are going to be the baby bird's motives. So maybe one is a major third and one is a minor sixth, and we need some contrasting stuff here. Maybe a minor third and a major second. So there's some interval ideas. I'll just write them down. So I actually noticed in the intervals I chose, almost all of them held in common the note F, except this one. So I wonder if actually it should be this instead, a fourth. And then you have a fourth, a sixth, a third, and a second, all with F as the common tone. So in that, they have this sense of sort of genetic relatedness, but they're all somehow different. Somehow there's a different expression of the same thing. So that's one way of looking at what an egg is, its potential. So in that case, we could compose a small motive or pick an interval or something like that that will represent each one of the different eggs. So another way of looking at an egg is more scientifically, like what actually is an egg? An egg is a hard shell, and inside is the white part of the egg, and then the yolk, and then inside that is the baby. And the baby is going to eat through all of that and then break out of the shell when there are no more resources left within the egg. What if there is a way to musically have that idea of something hard encasing something that's sort of vulnerable and soft, and the thing inside expanding and then eventually breaking outside of those bounds? So my first thought on this was maybe there's some kind of pitch constraint around the idea. So what if it was F, like I had already tried? So it's these Fs. That's the common tone between all these eggs. So what if inside here there's an interval that is very active, like this one? So basically what I did there was I had these Fs that kept repeating and kind of containing the material, and then once the material expanded and reached those Fs, it sort of broke out and took on a different character, which was wider harmonic spacing and sort of this undulation in and out and sort of almost frantic motion. When you look at the babies and they're getting fed, they feel very frantic, like ah! So this kind of that sort of frantic motion around. So there's one idea about how to also look at an egg as a scientific phenomenon. So the first one's more metaphorical, the next one's scientific. So those are my ideas about how to create musical ideas. I think that they both work really well for different circumstances. Sometimes we come into creative projects and we know what the piece needs to be about. It needs to be about birds or about sustainability. And so you come at it from a certain angle with extra musical ideas in your head. But other times we just get commissioned to write a piece for violin, cello, and piano, and we're like, what do we do? And then it's good to just go to the piano and play something. And then we ask ourselves, do we like that, or is that useful for something? Is that an interesting expression? Can that turn into a chord progression that we really like? Is there something within that chord that we like? And then we can break it apart and turn it into a piece in some way. So I'll do other videos eventually on how to really analyze a chord like that and turn it into sort of a theoretical system that we can use to generate a piece. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of today. Today's just about conceiving those ideas. So how do you get the first idea? I would recommend try things out, improvise, maybe play on an instrument that you don't normally play on to get yourself out of your own technique, that sort of thing. And then the second idea is have an extra musical inspiration and use that in some way to inspire you to generate musical material. So there's two ways of doing that. One, which is a more metaphorical way. What does this idea suggest to me? Or what does a bird, what is it metaphorically? It's like flying, it's like freedom. And then how do you capture that in music? Or then the other idea is more scientifically, like what is a bird? It is wings. It has the ability to generate lift with its wings. The wings move up and down to generate the lift. And is there a musical expression for that sort of more scientific phenomenon? Anyways, hope you found this super helpful. I'll be doing more of these in the future as I work on my thesis. It's a way to inspire me to keep working. So I'm going to go and get to work because there's a lot of work to be done. So thanks for watching. Subscribe if you like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.